The plane bucked like a wild animal caught in a snare, jerking so violently that overhead compartments burst open, ejecting luggage into the aisles. Screams erupted, a cacophony of panic that drowned out the crackling intercom and the frantic commands of the flight crew. The storm outside raged with unholy ferocity, rain hammering against the windows as streaks of lightning illuminated the chaos in harsh, strobing flashes. Dane Harper clung to his seat, his knuckles white against the armrests. A nauseating roll of the cabin sent his stomach plunging as though he were already falling through the storm. Someone yelled a prayer, their words fragmented by sobs. Another voice, louder and closer, cursed in futile rage against the wind howling through the cabin's cracks. Dane tried to focus, to latch onto something stable amid the madness, but all he could see was the lightning dancing in the dark sky. Then came the sound, the deep, guttural groan of metal tearing. The plane tilted sharply, throwing Dane against his seatbelt. The air turned acrid with the scent of burning wires and jet fuel. He caught a glimpse of the wing tearing away, spinning into the night, before the aircraft dropped like a stone. Everything went black. When Dane opened his eyes, the world was unrecognizable. A stinging pain in his temple throbbed in sync with his heartbeat, and something warm trickled down his face. Blood. His thoughts came sluggishly, struggling to coalesce into clarity, as he pushed himself upright. The plane, or what remained of it, was scattered in jagged pieces across the wet earth. Smoke rose from charred wreckage, the smell of burned fabric and flesh mingling with the tang of salt in the air. Dane's breath came in shallow, trembling gasps as he surveyed the scene. Bodies lay strewn across the sand, some still strapped into their seats, others crumpled in unnatural positions. A lump formed in his throat, but he forced himself to move. He staggered to his feet, his legs unsteady, and turned his gaze to the horizon. Dense jungle loomed just beyond the crash site, its edges dark and foreboding. Above it, the sky churned with storm clouds, but they seemed unnaturally stagnant, as though frozen in time. Then his eyes caught something else, a faint glow in the sand. At first, Dane thought his vision was playing tricks on him. The ground beneath him shimmered faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if tiny fireflies were trapped beneath the surface. He crouched and brushed aside a layer of wet sand, revealing strange carvings etched into the earth. The patterns were intricate, spiraling outward like a map of tangled roots. As he touched one, a jolt of heat shot through his fingertips, and he yanked his hand back. A sharp, stinging sensation radiated up his arm, and he stared down in horror as a faint mark began to form on his skin. It looked like one of the carvings, an angular, twisting line that pulsed faintly, glowing in time with the light beneath the sand. The jungle seemed to groan in response. Dane froze, his ears straining against the sudden stillness. The rhythmic crash of the waves faded to a whisper, drowned by the oppressive silence that had enveloped the crash site. Even the storm above had grown unnervingly quiet, its once deafening roars reduced to distant rumbles. Something was watching him. His instincts screamed for him to move. He stumbled toward the wreckage, scanning the debris for anything useful. His hand fell on a jagged piece of metal, and he gripped it tightly, though it offered little comfort. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as the oppressive feeling of being observed grew stronger. He turned his attention back to the jungle. The trees swayed gently in a non-existent breeze, their shadows shifting unnaturally. Dane tried to convince himself it was his imagination, a side effect of the concussion he was surely suffering from. But the carvings, both in the sand and on his skin, told a different story. He needed to move. The first step was harder than expected. His legs felt like lead, and the weight of fear pressed heavily on his chest. Each crunch of sand beneath his feet echoed too loudly in the eerie stillness. He approached a cluster of wreckage, searching for anything that could provide answers, or comfort. That was when he saw it. Just beyond the tree line, a faint red glow flickered, pulsing in time with the mark on his arm. It was subtle at first, a barely noticeable shimmer, but it quickly grew stronger. Dane's breath caught as he realized the light wasn't stationary. It was moving toward him. He took an instinctive step back, his heart pounding. The jungle seemed to exhale, a low, guttural sound that made his stomach churn. The glowing figure paused, hovering at the edge of the shadows, and Dane felt an inexplicable pull. It wasn't curiosity that drew him, it was something deeper, something primal. The mark on his arm flared, searing his skin with a sudden burst of heat. He cried out, clutching at it as he stumbled backward. The glow in the jungle intensified, and the ground beneath him trembled slightly. Whatever was out there, it knew he had arrived. Dane's mind raced as he staggered back to the center of the crash site. He could feel the glow of the jungle watching him, waiting. He didn't know what it wanted or why, but every instinct told him to prepare for the worst. The jungle had turned quiet again, but not peaceful. It was the silence of a predator lying in wait. Dane gripped his makeshift weapon tighter, scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. He knew one thing for certain: survival here wasn't just about escaping the elements. Something far darker was at play, and it had already marked him as part of its game. The storm had brought him here, but the island wasn't done with him yet. Dane jolted awake to the sound of something crunching nearby. His eyes shot open, and for a moment, he struggled to remember where he was. The crash site, the strange glowing mark on his arm, the oppressive jungle, reality settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The makeshift shelter he'd hastily constructed the night before was gone, reduced to splintered branches and scattered debris. His supplies, if a scavenged water bottle and some scraps of food could even be called that, were missing. He scrambled to his feet, scanning the area. That's when he saw the footprints. They were enormous. The prints formed a jagged circle around where he'd been sleeping, pressed deep into the damp sand. Each one was as wide as his torso, with elongated toes that ended in sharp, claw-like impressions. But it wasn't just their size that sent a chill down his spine. It was the way they stopped abruptly, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. The mark on his arm flared with sudden heat, the lines glowing faintly in the dim morning light. Dane hissed in pain, gripping it instinctively. "What the hell is happening?" he muttered, his voice hoarse and cracking. The jungle offered no reply, but the silence seemed heavier now, almost tangible. The footprints unnerved him more than he wanted to admit. He followed them for a few steps, hoping they'd lead to some clue about what he was dealing with. But after a few yards, they simply ended. No drag marks, no signs of a retreat, just nothing. Dane's skin prickled as a faint whispering sound reached his ears. It wasn't wind. It wasn't the rustling of leaves. It was something else, something that seemed to crawl into his skull and take root. He spun around, clutching the jagged piece of metal he'd taken from the wreckage. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice sharp and strained. The jungle remained still, but the whispers grew louder, closer. Desperate to distance himself from the phantom sounds, Dane moved toward the wreckage. He needed to find something useful, a weapon, more food, anything to improve his odds. As he picked through the debris, a glint of metal caught his eye. It was a rusted machete, half buried under a pile of broken luggage. The blade was dulled with age and the handle wrapped in rotting leather, but it was better than nothing. Dane gripped it tightly, its weight providing a small measure of comfort. A few feet away, something else caught his attention. It wasn't wreckage, it was a skeleton. The bones were weathered, some bleached and brittle, but their arrangement told a story. The skeleton was slumped against a jagged piece of metal, one hand clutching what appeared to be a journal. Dane hesitated, his instincts warring with his curiosity. Finally, he crouched and pried the journal loose. The leather cover was cracked and faded, and many of the pages were warped from moisture. Flipping through, he found most of it illegible, the ink smeared into indecipherable blotches. But a few entries remained intact. Day 3, the island isn't normal. It moves. It watches. I hear it at night, whispering my name. The others don't believe me, but they will. Soon. Dane's stomach churned as he read on. Day 7, it's hunting us. One by one. I've seen it, shadows in the trees, eyes like fire. The mark burns more now, as if it knows I'm trying to leave. The final entry was short, scrawled hastily across the page. Don't run. Don't hide. There's no escape. It always finds you. Dane closed the journal, his hand trembling. A cold sweat broke out across his skin as the jungle seemed to grow darker around him. A sudden rustling snapped him out of his thoughts. He whipped around, raising the machete. The shadows between the trees shifted unnaturally, shapes flickering in and out of existence like static on an old television. The whispers were back, louder this time, a cacophony of unintelligible voices overlapping each other. Dane's heart pounded in his chest as the mark on his arm burned hotter. He stumbled backward, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Something moved in the shadows. At first, it was only a blur, a fleeting flicker of movement too fast to follow. But then it stepped into the light. The creature was unlike anything Dane had ever seen. Its form was humanoid but grotesque, its limbs elongated and twisted at unnatural angles. Its skin shimmered faintly, the same eerie glow as the carvings in the sand. Two burning eyes stared at him, unblinking and filled with malice. Dane froze, every muscle in his body locked in terror. The creature tilted its head, as if studying him, and the whispers seemed to converge into a single, bone-chilling word. Run! He didn't need to be told twice. Dane turned and sprinted toward the jungle, his feet pounding against the sand. The trees loomed closer, their dark silhouettes clawing at the sky. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he couldn't stay. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more insistent with each step. The creature's presence was a weight on his back, its burning gaze searing into him even as he ran. He plunged into the jungle, branches clawing at his skin as he forced his way through the dense undergrowth. The air grew heavy, each breath a struggle as the oppressive atmosphere closed in around him. Behind him, the creature let out a sound, a guttural, inhuman growl that sent shivers down his spine. Dane didn't look back. Finally, he stumbled into a clearing, his lungs burning and his legs trembling with exhaustion. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. For a moment, the jungle was silent again, the whispers gone, the oppressive weight lifted. But then he saw them. More carvings, etched into the earth beneath his feet, glowing faintly in the dim light. They stretched outward in a spiraling pattern, leading toward a jagged stone altar at the center of the clearing. The mark on his arm pulsed in response, its glow matching the rhythm of the carvings. Dane's stomach sank as a horrifying realization dawned on him. The jungle wasn't just alive, it was waiting for him. The ground trembled beneath Dane's feet, a deep rumble that seemed to echo from the very heart of the island. He staggered back from the glowing carvings, his eyes darting to the stone altar at the center of the clearing. It loomed like a sentinel, jagged and weathered, its surface etched with the same intricate symbols that pulsed faintly on the ground, and on his arm. Before he could take another step, the earth split open. A deafening crack tore through the air, and the ground beneath the altar caved in, revealing a yawning chasm that plunged into utter darkness. Dust and debris clouded the air as Dane shielded his face, his heart hammering in his chest. The mark on his arm flared, tugging at him with an invisible force, pulling him toward the edge of the chasm. No! He muttered, digging his heels into the ground. Not a chance! But the pull grew stronger, more insistent. His legs moved against his will, each step dragging him closer to the abyss. He fought back with everything he had, clawing at the dirt, gripping at roots, but it was useless. Whatever force was guiding him was far stronger than his resistance. When his toes reached the edge, the ground gave way. Dane plummeted into the darkness, his screams swallowed by the void. The air rushed past him, cold and sharp, until, with a jarring impact, he hit something solid. He lay there for a moment, dazed and gasping for breath, his body aching from the fall. When he opened his eyes, he found himself in a cavern unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls glowed faintly, veins of luminous blue light running through the stone like the lifeblood of the island itself. The air was heavy and thick, each breath a struggle as he pushed himself to his feet. The carvings that had been etched into the ground above were here too, but they were more intricate, more alive. They shimmered and shifted as if watching him. The mark on his arm pulsed in time with the glowing veins, a steady rhythm that seemed to guide his gaze toward the far end of the cavern. There, illuminated by the strange light, was a massive stone door, its surface covered in carvings of monstrous creatures and twisted, humanoid figures. As Dane approached the door, he noticed something horrifying. The creatures depicted in the carvings weren't just ancient myths. They looked eerily similar to the grotesque thing that had chased him through the jungle. One figure, larger than the others, stood at the center of the door. Its burning eyes seemed to follow Dane as he moved closer. The whispers returned. This time, they were louder, clearer. Words formed in his mind, not his ears, a chorus of overlapping voices that spoke in an ancient, guttural language. Yet somehow, he understood. The heart. The blood. The choice. He swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the rusted machete in his hand. The door seemed to beckon him, its carvings writhing as if alive. He didn't want to go any closer, but the pull of the mark left him no choice. Each step brought him closer until he was standing directly before it. Without warning, the mark on his arm seared with unbearable heat. Dane cried out, falling to his knees as the pain surged through him. The door groaned, its massive stone slabs grinding open with a deafening roar. Beyond the door was a massive chamber, its center dominated by an enormous pulsating orb of light. It floated above the ground, tendrils of glowing energy extending from its surface to connect with the cavern walls. Dane's breath hitched as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't just a temple. It was the island's heart. The orb pulsed with a rhythm that matched the mark on his arm, a living, breathing entity that seemed to fill the space with its presence. Around the base of the orb were remnants of others who had come before him, skeletons, shattered weapons, and the tattered remains of clothing. Their bones were blackened, as if burned from the inside out. The whispers grew louder, the chorus of voices now a deafening roar in his mind. The heart. The blood. The choice. What do you want from me? Dane shouted, his voice echoing in the cavern. The orb pulsed violently, and one of its tendrils lashed out, striking the ground inches from where he knelt. The mark on his arm glowed brighter, its lines spreading further up his skin like roots digging into flesh. A cold, numbing fear crept over him as he realized what was happening. The island wasn't just alive, it was consuming him. Dane scrambled back, his eyes darting around the chamber for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. The door had sealed shut behind him, and the glowing tendrils now reached out, blocking every path. His gaze fell on an altar near the base of the orb. Upon it lay a jagged, ceremonial blade, its hilt wrapped in blackened leather. Beside the blade was a bowl filled with a thick, dark liquid that shimmered unnaturally. The carvings on the altar seemed to pulse in time with the orb, their meaning clear even without words. The choice. Dane's mind raced. The journal's warning came back to him. There's no escape. It always finds you. He was trapped in the heart of the island, facing a choice he didn't fully understand but knew he couldn't avoid. The orb pulsed again, sending another tendril lashing toward him. He barely dodged it, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever this ritual was, it was clear the island wanted him to complete it. But why? What would happen if he refused? His eyes darted to the blade, then to the orb. A terrible thought crept into his mind. What if this was the only way to stop it? The whispers shifted, no longer a chorus but a single voice, cold and commanding. Submit. Or be devoured. Dane gritted his teeth, his fingers curling around the hilt of the machete. He didn't know what he was going to do, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to die without a fight. The island pulsed, its tendrils closing in. Dane took a deep breath, his decision forming in the chaos of his mind. He had one chance. One choice. And the island was waiting. The island pulsed with a predatory rhythm, its glowing veins snaking closer with each passing second. Dane stood at the altar, the ceremonial blade in one hand and his machete in the other. His heart raced as the orb's light intensified, casting grotesque shadows on the cavern walls. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a single, suffocating presence, silent but all-encompassing. The choice. Dane's gaze darted between the ceremonial blade and the orb. The journal's warning echoed in his mind. Don't run. Don't hide. There's no escape. If he performed the ritual, would the island let him go? Or was it another trap, a twisted game with no end? The skeletons littering the chamber seemed to suggest the latter. A sudden tremor shook the cavern, and the orb flared violently. One of its tendrils lashed out, narrowly missing Dane as it struck the altar with a deafening crack. The blade clattered to the ground. The mark on his arm seared with unbearable heat, spreading up his shoulder and across his chest. Dane screamed, dropping to one knee as the pain racked his body. The island was done waiting. It was taking him. With a surge of adrenaline, Dane pushed himself to his feet, gripping the machete tightly. "You want me?" he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "Come and take me!" The orb responded with a low, guttural hum, its tendrils lunging toward him like the claws of a monstrous predator. Dane dodged the first strike, then the second, his movements clumsy but fueled by pure survival instinct. He ran toward the base of the orb, swinging the machete wildly. The blade connected with one of the glowing tendrils, slicing through it in a shower of sparks. The orb shrieked, a piercing, otherworldly sound that reverberated through the cavern. Dane didn't stop. He hacked at the tendrils as they came, each strike met with another agonized cry from the orb. The mark on his arm burned hotter with every blow, as if the island were punishing him for his defiance. When the last tendril fell, Dane stood panting, his body trembling with exhaustion. The orb flickered, its light dimming, but it wasn't defeated. The ground beneath him began to quake violently, cracks spidering outward from the altar as the island fought back. Dane turned his attention to the altar. The ceremonial blade glinted faintly in the dim light, its purpose clear. He grabbed it, his fingers trembling as he lifted it toward the orb. "Is this what you want?" he growled through gritted teeth. "Is this how it ends?" The orb flared brightly, its pulsing rhythm accelerating. The mark on his arm responded, glowing in perfect synchronization. Dane felt the pull again, stronger than ever, drawing him toward the heart of the island. "Submit." Dane hesitated, the blade trembling in his hand. The journal's words haunted him. "There's no escape. It always finds you." He wasn't sure if it was the orb's voice or his own doubt whispering in his mind, but the message was clear: there was no winning this fight. Unless... His eyes fell on the glowing veins running through the cavern walls. The orb wasn't just the island's heart, it was its lifeline. If he destroyed it, the island would die. But would it take him with it? Another tremor rocked the cavern, nearly knocking him off his feet. The orb's tendrils began to regenerate, slithering toward him with renewed fury. He didn't have time to weigh the risks. With a roar, Dane plunged the ceremonial blade into the base of the orb. The reaction was immediate. The orb exploded with blinding light, a shockwave ripping through the cavern. Dane was thrown backward, slamming into the jagged stone floor. His vision blurred, his ears ringing as the cavern began to collapse around him. The mark on his arm burned brighter than ever, its glow consuming his entire body. He screamed as the pain intensified, feeling as though the island itself were trying to tear him apart. The orb pulsed one final time before shattering into fragments of light. The glowing veins in the walls faded, their light extinguished. The cavern fell deathly silent. Dane lay motionless, his body broken and his breath shallow. The mark on his arm was gone, leaving only a faint scar as a reminder of the ordeal. The air around him felt lighter, the oppressive weight of the island's presence lifted. But the cavern was still collapsing. Summoning the last of his strength, Dane staggered to his feet and stumbled toward the jagged opening in the wall where the door had once been. The ground buckled beneath him as he climbed, rocks tumbling around him in a deafening cascade. When he finally emerged into the jungle, he collapsed onto the damp earth, gasping for air. The storm above had cleared, revealing a sky full of stars. The jungle was still and silent, no longer alive with the sinister energy that had haunted him since the crash. He was free. As Dane lay there, staring up at the stars, a faint whisper tickled the edge of his consciousness. It was barely audible, a ghost of the voices that had tormented him. "The storm always returns." His blood ran cold, but he forced himself to his feet. The island might not be done with him, but he wasn't going to wait around to find out. Dane turned toward the shore, his machete still clutched tightly in his hand. The horizon stretched out before him, endless and unforgiving, but it was better than the horrors he'd left behind. For now, the storm had passed. But deep in the heart of the island, something stirred. The storm would return.